My name is Margot Hayes, and I am 66 years old. What I am about to share with you is not just a story, but the wound that redefined my life forever. The day of my husband Ernest's funeral was meant to be a farewell filled with grief, but it became something far darker, a day when the foundations of everything I believed in crumbled beneath me. The sky hung heavy with gray clouds, pressing down on the small cemetery where only a handful of mourners stood. The pastor's voice echoed softly, words about eternal peace that barely reached my ears. All I could hear, truly hear, was the hollow sound of dirt striking the wooden coffin, each thud cutting into me like a blade. 42 years of marriage, a lifetime of laughter and hardship, now sealed inside a box. As I stood there, my hands trembling, clutching a black handkerchief damp with my tears, my phone suddenly vibrated inside my purse. At first, I thought it was nothing, maybe a message of condolence from a distant cousin or a neighbor too frail to attend. But when I pulled it out and saw the words glowing on the screen, my breath froze. "I'm alive. That's not me in the casket." The letters danced before my eyes. I thought I must have been hallucinating, a cruel trick of grief. My heart pounded so violently I could hear it in my ears. My fingers, shaking uncontrollably, tapped out a reply. "Who are you?" The response came almost instantly, swift as lightning. "I can't say. They're watching. Don't trust our sons." At that exact moment, I felt something inside me break apart. My soul split in two, half still clinging to the coffin in front of me, half pulled into a dark, terrifying unknown. My eyes, wet with tears, turned toward Charles and Henry, my sons, standing by their father's grave. Their expressions were too calm, their embraces earlier too cold, their tears strangely mechanical, as though they were performing grief rather than feeling it. Something was wrong, terribly, horribly wrong. Standing at that graveside, I could not help but be pulled backward into the folds of memory. For 42 years, Ernest had been more than my husband. He had been my partner, my refuge, my very reason for living. And as I stared at the casket that supposedly held him, the memories came rushing back, bittersweet and relentless. I first met Ernest when I was 24, in the small, unassuming town of Spring Creek. The streets were dusty back then, lined with cracked sidewalks and wooden storefronts that always smelled faintly of oil and rust. Life was modest, almost painfully so, but those streets held our dreams. I was working as a house cleaner, stretching every penny to care for my sick mother, while Ernest was mending bicycles in the tiny repair shop he had inherited from his father. We had nothing by society's measure, no fine clothes, no shining car, no future laid out neatly ahead of us. But what we did have was real love, something so rare and powerful that even poverty couldn't tarnish it. I remember it vividly. The first time he spoke to me. It was a Tuesday morning, and I was walking to the market in my faded green dress, the hem frayed, my old shoes squeaking with every step. Ernest stepped out of his shop, grease smeared across his hands and cheeks, yet he smiled at me with a shyness so tender it pierced straight into my heart. "Good morning, Margot," he said softly. His voice carried a warmth that felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "Need me to check out your bike?" The truth was, I didn't even own a bicycle, but I came up with some silly excuse just to keep the conversation alive. That tiny spark turned into afternoons spent beneath the great oak tree in Town Square Park, where we carved our initials into the bark as though time itself would preserve our promise. We whispered about futures we couldn't yet grasp, about the hope of building something together, even if it was just a life of patched roofs and second-hand clothes. In time, those stolen moments of laughter and dreaming turned into vows. Our wedding was simple, little more than a gathering of friends, but to us, it felt like stepping into eternity. We moved into a 2-bedroom house with a tin roof, so thin that when the rains came, we placed pots and pans everywhere to catch the drips. We should have felt defeated, but instead, we laughed at the music of the rain, striking metal, and danced barefoot across the wet floor, foolishly happy, unshaken by hardship. When Charles was born, I thought my heart might burst from joy. His wide eyes mirrored his father's, though his smile was all mine. 2 years later came Henry, with the same perfection, the same innocent beauty. I poured every ounce of myself into raising them, sacrificing comforts and dreams of my own. Ernest, for his part, was the most devoted father a family could ask for. He taught our boys to fish in the river every Sunday, to repair broken things with steady hands, and to close their eyes at night with the magic of bedtime stories. We were, or at least I believed we were, a family bound together by love and simplicity. We didn't have wealth, but we had each other, and at the time, that was more than enough. Little did I know, those same children I nurtured with every beat of my heart would one day stand beside a coffin and look at me with eyes that no longer seemed to belong to my sons. As Charles and Henry grew, so too did the distance I never expected to see in my family. In the beginning, they were like every other pair of brothers, curious, mischievous, sometimes inseparable. Charles, being the eldest, always carried a restless ambition in his eyes, a kind of fire that set him apart from the quiet rhythm of our modest lives. Even as a boy, he would ask questions that unsettled me. "Why don't we have a car like the Millers, Mom? Why do we live in a house with leaks when others have shiny roofs?" I would smile, smooth his hair, and tell him that one day he'd understand that happiness wasn't measured in things. But deep down, I wondered if my words ever reached him. Henry, sweet Henry, followed every step his older brother took. He was quieter, more hesitant, yet his loyalty to Charles was unshakable. If Charles wanted something, Henry wanted it too. That bond, once innocent, would later prove to be dangerous. When Charles turned 18, Ernest tried to pass down the legacy of his little repair shop. He placed a set of tools in his son's hands, his voice gentle but proud. "This shop built our lives, son. It kept food on the table. With your hands, you can make something honest, something of your own." But Charles recoiled as if Ernest had handed him a burden instead of a gift. His words still burn in my memory. "I don't want to get my hands dirty like you, Dad. I'm going to be someone important." Ernest's silence afterward was heavier than any argument could have been. At night, I would find him sitting on the porch, staring at the sky with that faraway look. He didn't say it aloud, but I knew the rejection cut him deeply, not just of the shop, but of the life we had built with sacrifice and sweat. Years slipped by, and against all odds, Charles did find a place in the world of business. He dressed in sharp suits and drove sleek cars, his words filled with investments and deals I barely understood. Henry followed closely behind, shadowing his brother into that glossy city life. At first, my heart swelled with pride. Our boys had escaped poverty. They had opportunities Ernest and I never dared dream of. But soon, that pride turned hollow. Their visits grew rare, and their phone calls shorter. When they did return home, it was as if they were strangers arriving from a different universe. They would step out of expensive cars, wearing cologne that clung to the air, and glance around our humble house with eyes that carried pity, sometimes even shame. One evening, Charles placed his hand on mine across the dinner table. "Mom, you and Dad should move somewhere better. This house, it's falling apart." He wasn't wrong. The roof sagged, the paint peeled, the boards groaned beneath our feet. But that house was more than wood and nails. It was the heartbeat of our lives. It was where we had watched them take their first steps, where Ernest and I had whispered in the dark about dreams we could barely afford. Every memory, every sacrifice, was embedded in its walls. Later that night, Ernest said words that pierced me with their quiet truth. "Margot, money has changed our boys. We aren't enough for them anymore." I wanted to argue, to tell him that it was just a phase, that deep down Charles and Henry were still the children we raised. I clung to that hope with desperate hands, but in my heart, I felt the same chill he did. We had lost something precious long before Ernest's body was lowered into the ground. The most painful shift in our family came the day Charles brought Jasmine into our home. I still remember it vividly, the way her high heels sank into the soft dirt of our porch, the bright red of her dress clashing against the weathered wood of the house, the faint trace of expensive perfume drifting into the air, covering the familiar scent of Ernest's shop oil and my simmering stew. "Nice to meet you," she said, her voice smooth but distant. Her handshake was nothing more than the tips of her fingers brushing mine. Her eyes scanned our humble living room, the worn curtains, the patched cushions, the old family photographs on the wall. In that gaze, I saw something I couldn't quite name: disdain, maybe, or worse, shame. Dinner that evening was a quiet battlefield. I had prepared meatloaf and roasted chicken, recipes that had carried my family through decades of gatherings. I set the table with care, even polishing the old silverware Ernest's mother had given us, but Jasmine barely touched her plate. She moved food around with her fork, cutting pieces so small they were almost invisible, nibbling without ever truly eating. Her lipstick left perfect, untouched prints on the rim of her wine glass. Charles, once so proud of his mother's cooking, fidgeted beside her. "Next time, we'll take them out to a restaurant," he whispered, his voice meant for Jasmine alone, but my ears caught every syllable. That single sentence landed in my chest like a knife. In his attempt to impress her, he had quietly disowned the table that had raised him, the meals that had sustained him. I glanced across the table at Ernest. He chewed slowly, his eyes lowered, his silence louder than any protest. I could feel the hurt radiating from him, but he kept it buried, as he always did, beneath layers of quiet dignity. Henry, meanwhile, was there too. Though his presence was more like a shadow, he didn't bring anyone home. He had chosen a life of business, travel, and endless phone calls. Even at dinner, his fingers danced across his phone screen, murmuring about deals while I tried to keep conversation alive. "Mom, I have to go," he would say abruptly, rising from his chair before dessert, as though his family time was nothing more than an obligation to be crossed off his list. Our family Sundays, once filled with laughter, had faded into memory. Christmas gatherings became stiff, cold performances. The boys would arrive in polished cars, carrying expensive gifts, designer scarves, gadgets, bottles of wine we didn't need. They would stay for 2 hours, 3 at most, before excusing themselves, rushing back to their city lives. Late at night, Ernest and I would sit side by side on the porch, the air cool and heavy with silence. His hands, once strong and sure from years in the shop, trembled slightly as he sipped his coffee. "Do you know what the saddest part is, Margot?" he said one evening, his eyes lost in the stars. "It's not that they have money, it's that the money made them forget who we are. To them, we're not their parents anymore. We're something to be embarrassed about." I reached for his hand, clutching it tightly, but I had no answer. Deep inside, I feared he was right. The family I had given my life to was slipping away, and I was powerless to stop it. Time moved on, and with each passing season, the distance between us and our sons grew wider, like a canyon carved silently by years of neglect. Ernest still spent his days in the shop, though his hands no longer had the strength they once carried. I continued sewing dresses for the women in town, my eyesight weaker, the threads often slipping from my needle. Yet through all of life's limitations, we survived not with wealth, but with dignity. It was during one of those strained visits that Jasmine finally revealed her true thoughts. She walked through our doorway with that polished stride of hers, her heels clicking against the wooden floor. She barely sat down before saying, "You should sell this house and move into a retirement community. There are wonderful places now, comfortable, modern, suited for people your age." Her words sliced through the air. A retirement community, as if 40 years of building a home, of raising children within these walls, could be dismissed like an old coat, ready to be thrown away. Ernest, with that unshakable pride that had always defined him, replied firmly, "We don't need a home, Jasmine. We are fine here, in the house where we've lived our lives." But I saw the look on Charles's face, the quiet approval in Henry's eyes. They agreed with her. To them, our house was no longer a sanctuary. It was a burden, a problem to be solved. Soon after, Charles arrived carrying papers in his briefcase. He spread them neatly across the table, his smile as practiced as any salesman's. "Dad, Mom," he began, "I've been thinking about your future. This house isn't worth much, maybe $1,000 at most. If you sell it, I can add money of my own to help you move somewhere better. A smaller place, more convenient. To us, there was no place better. That house was more than walls and a roof. It was where Ernest and I had danced in the rain when the roof leaked, where we had whispered to our boys as they fell asleep, where every sacrifice and joy of our lives was preserved." Charles didn't see memories. He only saw numbers. Henry, as always, stood by his brother's side. Besides, Dad should really retire. He's already 70. It's time to rest. What if he gets hurt in that shop? An accident at his age could be fatal. Their voices sounded caring, but beneath the surface, I caught something sharper. A rush, an impatience, a quiet urgency I couldn't explain but felt deep in my bones. In the weeks that followed, the pressure increased. Real estate agents came to the house uninvited, telling us they had been asked to appraise the property. We never called them. The boys arranged meetings with people behind our backs, insisting it was for our own good. One night, during an uncomfortable dinner, Charles leaned forward and said, "Jasmine and I are planning to have children soon. We'll need help with the expenses. If you sell the house, that money could be an early inheritance." I nearly dropped my fork. An early inheritance while Ernest and I were still alive. My husband's jaw tightened, though his voice remained calm. "Son, when your mother and I die, everything we have will be yours. But while we're alive, the decisions are ours to make." Henry's tone grew harsher, his patience cracking. "Don't be stubborn, Dad. You're living in the past. It's time to be practical." That night, long after they left, Ernest and I stayed awake until dawn. He held my hand tightly, his voice heavy with worry I had never heard before. "Something is wrong, Margot. This isn't just impatience. This isn't just ambition. There's something darker driving them." I wanted to believe he was exaggerating, that our boys could never truly mean us harm. But deep in my heart, I felt the first seeds of fear take root. The weeks that followed were some of the most tense of my life. Our sons, our own flesh and blood, seemed to tighten their grip around us with every passing day. What once felt like concern for our well-being began to reveal itself as something more insistent, something that carried the edge of menace. They came often, but not with warmth or affection. Instead, they came with plans, with numbers, with offers we had never asked for. One afternoon, without warning, Charles brought a real estate agent to the house. I had just finished baking bread, the smell still lingering in the kitchen, when a man in a pressed suit walked through my doorway with a clipboard in hand. "Lovely property," he said flatly, tapping the walls, glancing at the ceiling, scribbling notes as if our home was nothing more than a figure in his ledger. I stood frozen, clutching the tray of bread, my knuckles white. "We had the place appraised," Charles explained, his voice too casual. "It's just paperwork, Mom. Nothing final. We're only preparing options. Options. Always for our good. Always without our consent." They even spoke of Ernest's shop, the one place in the world that still gave my husband joy. "Dad, you should close it down," Henry insisted during one of those dinners where the food went cold on our plates because the air between us was too heavy to eat. "At your age, one accident could mean the end. It's time to stop pretending you're young." Ernest looked at him with eyes full of sorrow. "Son, working is not a burden to me. It's what keeps me alive. The shop gives my days meaning. Without it, I would have nothing." But Henry only exchanged a look with Charles, that same silent agreement they had shared since childhood, only now it was sharpened, deliberate. The final blow came one evening when Charles leaned across the table, his smile too polished, his tone dripping with false kindness. "Look, Mom, Dad, Jasmine and I are planning to start a family. You want us to be happy, don't you? If you sell the house, the money could help all of us. Think of it as an early inheritance." Early inheritance. The word struck like ice through my veins. How dare they speak of inheritance while Ernest sat right there, alive, his hands folded quietly in his lap. Ernest's jaw tightened, though his voice remained steady. "Son, when your mother and I die, everything will be yours. But while we are alive, the choices are ours." Henry's mask slipped then, his voice harsher than I had ever heard. "You're old now. You can't keep living in the past." For the first time, I saw not just distance in their eyes, but something darker, something cold. That night, Ernest and I stayed awake long after midnight, the lamp casting dim light across the worn wooden walls of our bedroom. His voice was heavy, laced with worry. "Margot, I don't think this is just about impatience or ambition. There's more to it, something I can't quite see yet, but it frightens me. I clutched his hand, trying to steady my own racing heart. Deep down, I knew he was right. For the first time in all my years as a mother, I wondered, what if the people I had loved most in this world were no longer the sons I thought I knew? The last normal conversation I ever had with Charles happened 3 weeks before Ernest's death. It was a Sunday morning, the kind of morning that should have been peaceful, the sun rising gently over Spring Creek, the smell of coffee filling the kitchen, the old clock ticking steadily on the wall. Yet there was a heaviness in the air, a silence that clung like a shadow. Charles arrived without Jasmine, which immediately surprised me. He walked into the house not as the boy I had raised, but as a man carrying the weight of secrets in his briefcase and the tension of a stranger in his shoulders. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he had eaten bowls of oatmeal as a child, where he had once giggled over spilled milk, where he had whispered his dreams of becoming someone important. His hands rested on the wood, but his fingers tapped nervously, betraying the calm mask he wore. Finally, he looked at me, his eyes strangely solemn. "Mom," he said, his voice unusually measured, "I want you to know that no matter what happens, Henry and I will always take care of you." At the time, his words soothed me. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to think that beneath the ambition and distance, my son still carried love for his mother. I nodded, touched his hand lightly, and told him, "I know, son, you and Henry are all I have left. I trust you both." But now, standing at Ernest's grave weeks later, those words twisted inside me like a blade. No matter what happens, what had he meant? What did he know that I didn't? The accident that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning. Ernest rose early, as he had for more than 40 years. The smell of fresh coffee filled the house, and I stood in the kitchen preparing his favorite lunch meatloaf with mashed potatoes, something I had made for him countless times before. The rhythm of that morning felt so ordinary, so familiar, that I could never have imagined it would be the last. The phone rang suddenly, its shrill cry slicing through the quiet kitchen. I answered, my heart pounding without reason. A voice I didn't recognize spoke on the other end, firm but urgent. "Mrs. Hayes, I'm calling from Memorial Hospital. Your husband has been in a serious accident. You need to come immediately." The world around me blurred. My knees nearly gave out, and I had to grip the door frame to steady myself. My voice trembled. "What happened? Is he alive? Is he, please? Tell me he's okay." The reply was calm but merciless. "Ma'am, please come as soon as possible." I could barely breathe. The air itself felt heavy in my chest. My neighbor, Doris, seeing my distress, insisted on driving me. My hands shook so violently I couldn't even hold the car keys. As the car rolled toward the hospital, the town around me seemed unfamiliar, the streets distorted by fear. My mind refused to accept the truth. Ernest was careful, meticulous. How could he possibly have suffered such a serious accident in the very shop he had maintained like the back of his hand? When we arrived at Memorial Hospital, I was shocked to see Charles and Henry already there. Neither the hospital nor I had called them. How could they have known so quickly? The question lingered in my mind, but in my panic, I brushed it aside. Charles hugged me tightly, his voice heavy with false sorrow. "Mom, Dad is in bad shape. The doctors said one of the machines exploded. He has severe burns and a traumatic brain injury." Henry's eyes were red, but his expression was not grief. It was tension, almost impatience, as though he were waiting for a verdict. Something inside me recoiled, but I forced myself to believe my sons. I forced myself to trust them, even as doubt gnawed quietly at my heart. The first time I entered Ernest's hospital room, my world nearly collapsed. The steady beep of machines filled the sterile air, each sound a reminder of the fragile thread by which his life was hanging. Tubes and wires wrapped around him like cruel chains. His face and arms were covered in thick white bandages, leaving only his hand uncovered, his strong, familiar hand that had once built bicycles, repaired roofs, and held me during nights of thunder. I took that hand in mine, and it felt warm, achingly alive. "Ernest, my love," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I'm here. You're going to be all right. You'll fight through this just like you always have." For the briefest moment, I felt the faintest pressure, his fingers tightening against mine. His eyelids fluttered, as though he was battling to rise from the darkness. My heart leapt. "He's trying to respond," I cried, but the nurse who entered only shook her head. "Sometimes the muscles twitch, ma'am. It doesn't mean he's conscious." They didn't feel what I felt. I knew Ernest was there, trapped, trying to speak to me. The next 3 days stretched into an eternity. I practically lived in the hospital's waiting room, sleeping on stiff chairs, waking to the smell of disinfectant and the murmur of passing nurses. Doris brought me food, but I barely touched it. My whole existence narrowed to the few precious minutes I was allowed at Ernest's side. Charles and Henry took turns sitting with me, though their presence brought me little comfort. I noticed how often they spoke with the doctors in hushed tones, asking about insurance policies, medical coverage, and the cost of prolonged care. I overheard Charles on the phone, his voice low but clear enough. "Yes, the policy covers 50,000 plus workers' comp." I froze where I stood, the words cutting through me. Why was he talking about insurance when his father was still fighting for his life? When I confronted him, my voice sharper than I intended, Charles only smiled, that same smile he used to mask everything. "Don't worry, Mom. We're just making sure you're protected." Protected. The word rang hollow, colder than the hospital walls. On the 3rd day, Dr. Patterson, a man with kind eyes but a voice heavy with sorrow, asked me to step into his office. "Mrs. Hayes," he said gently, "your husband's condition is critical. The burns have become infected, and the head trauma is worse than we thought. We must be realistic about his chances." My throat tightened. "What do you mean?" He folded his hands on the desk. "It means we must prepare for the possibility that he may never regain consciousness. His body can be kept alive indefinitely, but his quality of life—" He stopped, letting silence finish the thought. I broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. 42 years of marriage, and now I was being asked to accept that it was all ending here, in this sterile room, with Ernest tethered to machines. But when I left the office, I noticed the look exchanged between Charles and Henry. Their expressions weren't just sorrowful, they were calculating. Henry's voice was too calm, too rehearsed. "Mom, Dad wouldn't want to live like this. He always said he didn't want to be a burden." A burden. The word hit me like a slap. My husband, the man who had sacrificed his youth, his strength, his entire life for our family, called a burden by the sons he had raised. My grief gave way to fury. "He is not a burden," I hissed. "He's your father." They nodded, their faces composed, but behind their eyes, I saw something chilling, a plan. That night, alone in Ernest's room, I held his hand and whispered desperately, "If you can hear me, fight. Please, fight. I can't lose you. Not like this." And then, as if answering my plea, his lips moved slightly. No sound came out, but I knew. He was trying to tell me something important. 2 days later, before dawn, the sound of alarms jolted me awake from the hard bench in the hospital corridor. Red lights flashed above the ICU doors, and nurses rushed past me with urgent voices, their shoes squeaking against the polished floors. My heart stopped before I even knew why. "No, no, please, no," I whispered, stumbling forward. My legs felt like water, my breath like fire in my throat. I pushed open the ICU door just in time to see the doctors bent over Ernest's fragile body, their hands pressing rhythmically against his chest, their voices calling for medication, for oxygen, for one more chance. "Come back to me, Ernest," I cried, clinging to the doorway. Doris pulled me back gently, but I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't breathe. For 40 minutes, I watched them battle the inevitable, watched machines scream their desperate chorus. And then, at 4:37 inches the morning, the sound I dreaded most filled the air, a flat, unbroken tone. Time of death, 4:37. The words cut my world in half. I collapsed against the side of the bed, my arms wrapping around Ernest's still warm body. His scent still lingered faintly, mixed with antiseptic and ash, and I buried my face against his shoulder as if I could hold him here with me by sheer force of will. "Don't leave me," I whispered again and again, but the silence answered me back. An hour later, Charles and Henry arrived. Too soon, too prepared. Their expressions were grim but not surprised. They carried with them papers, documents, phone numbers for funeral homes. "We already spoke to the Spring Creek Funeral Home," Charles said calmly, his tone efficient, businesslike. "They can take care of everything today," Henry added. "We've also contacted the insurance company. The claim process is already in motion." I stared at them, my face wet with tears, unable to comprehend how their first instinct was not to weep for their father, but to organize, to calculate, to move forward as if his life had been a ledger closed with a single stroke of ink. The funeral was scheduled with startling speed just a few days later. I wasn't even asked what I wanted. Charles made the arrangements, choosing the simplest casket, the shortest service. "It's what Dad would have wanted," he insisted when I questioned him. But deep down, I knew Ernest deserved more. He deserved a farewell that honored his life, not this indecent rush to bury him and be done. When the day arrived, the sky was heavy with clouds, as though the heavens themselves grieved. I wore my only black dress, the one I had worn to my mother's funeral years before. My hands shook so violently that Doris had to fasten the buttons for me. She whispered, "Be strong, Margot. Ernest would want that." But I didn't feel strong. I felt hollow, like a shell cracked open and emptied. The cemetery was quiet, too quiet. Only a handful of people attended: Charles, Henry, Jasmine, Doris, myself, and the pastor. Where were Ernest's co-workers, his neighbors, the friends he had known all his life? Charles had told me, "We didn't want to bother anyone. Dad was private. He would have preferred something intimate." But that wasn't true. Ernest loved people. He had built his life around community, laughter, small favors for neighbors in need. He would have wanted them there. As the service dragged on, I studied my sons. Charles wore an expression of solemn respect, but his eyes kept darting toward his watch, as though the minutes were a burden. Henry fidgeted, restless, impatient, his gaze unfocused. Jasmine, veiled in black lace, discreetly checked her phone when she thought no one was looking. When it came time to throw the first handful of dirt onto the coffin, my body rebelled, my knees weakened, my chest constricted. Doris had to hold me up as I sobbed uncontrollably, the hollow thud of earth on wood reverberating through my bones. It was a sound that felt final, merciless. And then, in that moment of rawest grief, my phone vibrated in my purse. I pulled it out with trembling hands, my vision blurred by tears. A new message appeared on the screen. "I'm alive. That's not me in the casket." The ground seemed to shift beneath me. My heart pounded so hard, I thought I might faint. With hands that shook uncontrollably, I typed back, "Who are you?" The reply came almost instantly. "I can't say. They're watching. Don't trust our sons." I froze, my blood turning to ice. My sons, the very men standing only feet away, suddenly looked like strangers, shadows cloaked in suspicion. On the way home from the funeral, the words from that mysterious message echoed in my head like a haunting refrain. "I'm alive. That's not me in the casket. Don't trust our sons." I clutched my purse tightly, afraid someone might sense the secret burning inside it. My eyes darted to Charles and Henry as they walked beside me. Their steps were steady, their conversations measured, but suddenly everything about them felt wrong. When Charles asked softly, "Are you all right, Mom?" I could only nod, forcing a faint smile. But inside, my soul screamed. His face looked so sincere, his eyes so full of practiced concern, yet all I could see was suspicion. Every word, every gesture, every breath seemed rehearsed, like an actor wearing the mask of a son. That night, in the silence of my house, I sat in the kitchen staring at the phone, replaying the last few days in my mind. The details refused to line up. Ernest had been meticulous with his shop, every machine cared for, every screw tightened, every risk calculated. How could there have been an explosion? How had Charles and Henry known so quickly when the hospital had called only me? Why had their first words not been grief, but talk of insurance and funeral costs? I opened Ernest's old wooden desk, where he kept his papers neatly organized in a metal box. Insurance policies, the deed to our house, bank documents. I flipped through them with trembling hands until I found it the life insurance Charles had mentioned. $50,000. But my heart nearly stopped when I saw the update date, just 6 months earlier. Ernest had increased his coverage tenfold. Why hadn't he told me? More importantly, who had convinced him to do it? Beneath the insurance folder, I found another document, a workers' compensation policy purchased only 2 months before his so-called accident. My hands shook as I read the clauses. Coverage in case of accidental death at work, $15,000, a fortune for a family like ours. The phone buzzed again. Another message lit up the screen. Check the bank account, see who has been moving money. My pulse quickened. Whoever was sending these texts knew too much. Too many details to be coincidence. It couldn't be a prank, not with this level of precision. The next morning I went to the bank. Mrs. Thompson, the branch manager who had known Ernest and me for decades, greeted me with soft eyes full of sympathy. "Margot, I'm so sorry about Ernest. He was such a good man." "Thank you," I whispered. My voice was barely steady. I need to check our accounts. I need to understand what's been happening." She pulled the records for the last 6 months, spreading the statements across the desk. My heart froze as I scanned the pages. Large withdrawals, 1,000 in January, 3,000 in February, 4,000 in March. Thousands of dollars I had never seen, never approved, gone without my knowledge. "Who authorized these withdrawals?" I asked, my throat dry. "Your husband," Mrs. Thompson said gently. "He came in himself, said it was for repairs at the shop, but I knew that wasn't true. Ernest was careful with every cent, and I managed all the household accounts. He would never have hidden such expenses from me." My eyes fell to the signatures on the receipts. Yes, they looked like his, but shaky, uncertain, nothing like the strong, confident hand that had signed every check and letter for decades. "Did he ever come alone?" I asked, my voice trembling. Mrs. Thompson hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Now that you mention it, no. Once or twice, he was with your son, Charles, I think. He said he was helping his dad with the paperwork because Ernest had trouble reading without his glasses. But Ernest never needed help reading. He never went a single day without those glasses on his nose." My breath came shallow. My chest felt tight. That afternoon, as I sat at the kitchen table staring at those forged receipts, the phone buzzed again. The insurance was their idea. They pressured Ernest. It was a trap. The walls of my home seemed to close in. My hands trembled as I clutched the phone. The pieces were coming together now, pieces I wished I had never seen. And for the first time in my life, I felt the icy truth creep in. My sons were not just neglectful, not just ambitious. They were dangerous. Sleep abandoned me. Every creak of the house that night sounded like a whisper of betrayal. I couldn't rest until I had answers. The next morning, I followed the instructions from the mysterious messages. My hands shook as I locked the door behind me and made my way to Ernest's shop. Charles had claimed there was an explosion. The image haunted me: sparks, fire, twisted metal. Yet when I stepped inside, what I saw made my breath catch. The shop was spotless, too spotless. The floor gleamed as though freshly scrubbed. The walls bore no scorch marks, no cracks from an alleged blast. Every tool hung neatly on the wall. The welder, the compressor, the saw, all intact, all untouched. My heart pounded. Where was the machine that exploded? I whispered the question into the silence, my voice breaking as though Ernest might somehow answer. But only the hum of the ceiling light replied. Drawn by desperation, I went to his desk. Ernest always kept his most important notes there. Scraps of paper filled with numbers, sketches, reminders. My hands rifled through until I found it. A piece of paper dated 3 days before his death. The handwriting was his, the ink smudged where his hand must have lingered. "Charles insists I need more insurance. He says it's for Margot, but something doesn't feel right. I don't trust his intentions." My stomach turned. The room swayed. The very words I had feared were now staring back at me. Ernest had felt it too, the unease, the suspicion. Beneath that note lay another, hastily written. "Henry brought me some papers to sign. He said it's to modernize the shop, but I don't understand them. Why the hurry?" Tears filled my eyes. My husband, always cautious, had seen the storm gathering. He had known. And then, tucked deep in the drawer, sealed in an envelope with my name written carefully across the front, I found it a letter. My fingers trembled as I broke the seal. Ernest's handwriting filled the page. My dearest Margot, if you are reading this, it means something has happened to me. In recent months, I have noticed strange changes in Charles and Henry. They are too interested in our money, in the insurance, in selling the house. Jasmine pushes them constantly. Yesterday, Charles told me I should be more careful, because at my age, any accident could be fatal. I don't know why, but his words felt like a threat. I love you more than anything, Margot. Please, if something happens, don't trust blindly, not even our sons. The letter slipped from my hands, fluttering to the floor. My knees buckled as I pressed my palms to the cold metal desk. The truth that I had resisted so fiercely was now undeniable. Ernest had sensed his own death. He had known that the very children we had raised with love might be plotting against him. I sat there for what felt like hours, the words echoing in my mind. Don't trust our sons. That evening, Charles appeared at my door with a bottle of wine, his smile polished, his tone dripping with false sweetness. He poured himself a glass before even asking if I wanted any. Mom, he began, his eyes glinting, the insurance money is being processed. You'll receive $15,000. My heart nearly stopped. How did he know the exact amount? I helped Dad with the paperwork, he explained smoothly. He wanted to make sure you'd have enough to live comfortably. But I remembered Ernest's note. He hadn't wanted it. He had been pressured. My lips trembled, but I forced my voice to remain steady. And what do you think I should do with the money? Charles's eyes lit with a greed he barely disguised. You could buy a smaller house or move into a retirement community. Henry and I could manage your finances, make it grow, triple it in just a few years. Manage my money. My stomach twisted with rage and fear. They weren't done. Taking Ernest wasn't enough. They wanted everything. After they left, the house felt colder than ever. I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the letter in my hand, Ernest's warning replaying in my ears. For the first time, I whispered aloud the truth I had been too afraid to accept. My sons killed their father. That night, I barely slept. Every sound in the house, the creak of the floorboards, the moan of the wind against the windows felt like a warning. My husband's words in the letter would not leave me. Don't trust blindly, not even our sons. At dawn, another message lit up my phone. The same unknown number, the same hand guiding me deeper into a truth I feared to uncover. Go to the police station. Ask for the report on Ernest's accident. You will find contradictions. With trembling hands, I dressed and walked to the station, my heart heavy in my chest. Sergeant O'Connell, a man who had known Ernest for years, greeted me with a look of pity. Mrs. Hayes, he said softly, I'm so sorry about your loss. Ernest was a good man. I swallowed hard. Thank you. I need to see the official report about my husband's accident at the shop. He frowned, flipping through files on his desk. Accident at the shop? He shook his head. We don't have any report like that here. I blinked, confused. What do you mean? The hospital said there was an explosion. That's why he was injured. The sergeant looked at me gravely. No, ma'am. According to the medical report, your husband didn't come in from an explosion. He arrived unconscious with symptoms of poisoning. The doctors found traces of methanol in his blood, enough to cause blindness, brain damage, and eventually death. The world spun around me, my stomach twisted. Poisoning? The word clawed out of my throat like a scream. Yes, methanol, he said. But the immediate family requested the information be kept confidential to spare you distress. They signed the forms themselves. The immediate family. My voice cracked. You mean Charles and Henry? The sergeant nodded. I staggered back, clutching the edge of his desk for balance. My sons hadn't just lied, they had erased the truth, built a story of explosions and accidents to cover a crime far darker. When I returned home, Henry arrived not long after, carrying flowers and wearing the same strained smile. He set the bouquet on the table, his words soft but hollow. Mom, you look tired. You shouldn't stress yourself so much." I looked straight into his eyes, no longer seeing my boy but a stranger. "You knew," I whispered. "You knew your father didn't die from an accident." For a heartbeat, his face faltered. Panic flashed in his eyes before he quickly masked it with feigned concern. "What are you talking about, Mom? You must be confused. The grief, it's clouding your mind." "No," I said firmly, my voice trembling but resolute. "I went to the police. There was no explosion. There was no accident. Your father was poisoned." The mask cracked further. Henry stood abruptly, knocking over the coffee I had poured for him. His hands trembled as he grabbed his phone, stepping onto the porch to make a hurried call. Though I couldn't hear his words, the urgency in his tone was unmistakable. That night, another message arrived on my phone. Longer this time, more urgent. "They will come together tomorrow. They will try to convince you that you are losing your mind. Don't believe them. And whatever you do, don't eat or drink anything they bring." I sat alone in the dim kitchen, the glow of the lamp flickering across Ernest's abandoned chair. My heart pounded with terror, but also with clarity. The truth was laid bare before me now. Ernest had not been the victim of fate, he had been murdered. And the killers were the very sons I had carried, nurtured, and loved with every fiber of my being. The very next morning, just as the mysterious message had warned, both of my sons arrived together. Charles was leading the way, his suit pressed, his face composed in a performance of concern. Henry followed close behind, carrying a paper bag from the downtown bakery. Jasmine trailed after them, dressed impeccably in black, her eyes sharp behind her veil of false sweetness. "Mom," Charles said as soon as he stepped into the kitchen, his voice dripping with practiced gentleness, "we're worried about you. The neighbors say you've been acting strangely. Doris even mentioned you've been talking to yourself." My stomach tightened. Doris had never said such a thing. It was a lie, a carefully planted seed. Henry placed the bag on the table with exaggerated cheer. "We brought your favorite pastries and coffee, the special brand you like." I stared at the bag as though it were poison itself. The words from last night's message thundered in my mind. "Don't eat or drink anything they bring." My lips pressed into a thin line. "Thank you, but I already had breakfast." Jasmine stepped closer, her smile soft, but her eyes cold. "Oh, but you must eat, Margot. You've lost weight. You need strength." I said no. I replied firmly, my voice stronger than I expected. The three of them exchanged a look, a silent conversation I wasn't meant to see. I felt the walls closing in, my own kitchen turning into a trap. Charles pulled a chair closer to me, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "Mom, we need to talk about something important. Henry and I spoke to some doctors. They're concerned about your behavior. The questions you've been asking, the visits to the police. It's normal after losing Dad, but it can turn dangerous if not treated." My blood ran cold. "Doctors?" I asked sharply. "What doctors?" Henry's expression was solemn, too rehearsed. "Dr. Albright. He specializes in mental health for older patients. He says women your age often develop paranoia after losing a spouse." Paranoia. They were painting me as insane. "I am not paranoid," I said, my voice trembling with both fear and fury. "I am asking questions I should have asked from the beginning. Why was there no report of your father's accident? Why was the shop perfectly clean if there was an explosion? Why were thousands of dollars withdrawn from our account without my knowledge?" Silence fell over the room like a heavy curtain. Charles's jaw tightened. Henry's eyes darted away. Jasmine's fingers drummed against the table nervously. For the first time, their masks slipped, even if only for a second. Then Charles leaned back, forcing a smile that chilled me to the bone. "Mom, you're confused. Grief does this. That's why we thought it would be best for you to move into a place where you'll have professional care, a home, somewhere safe." "A home?" I spat the word, my chest heaving. "You mean a prison. You want me declared incompetent so you can take everything Ernest and I built." The room grew tense. Henry leaned forward, his voice lower, firmer. "Mom, if you refuse, we'll have no choice but to go to court. We already have testimony. Dr. Albright signed a preliminary report saying you're unfit to live alone. We'll win." The words struck like daggers. My own sons, my flesh and blood, were threatening to strip me of my freedom, to erase me as surely as they had erased Ernest. I sat there, trembling but unbroken, my mind racing. Ernest's warning, the mysterious messages, the forged papers, it all led to this moment. And as I looked into their eyes, I knew, if I faltered now, if I let them take control, I would not survive. That night, after my sons left with their veiled threats and false sweetness, I sat at the kitchen table, my hands trembling as I clutched my phone. I could still hear Charles's words echoing in my head. Either you cooperate voluntarily, or we'll go to court. The weight of it pressed on my chest like a stone. Hours passed in silence until my phone vibrated again. Another message from the unknown number. But this time, it was longer, more direct, as though the writer could no longer remain in the shadows. Margot, this is Stephen Callahan, a private investigator. Ernest hired me 3 weeks before his death because he was suspicious of Charles and Henry. They poisoned him with methanol in his coffee. I have audio evidence of their conversations planning it. Meet me tomorrow, 3 p.m., at the corner cafe. Sit at the back table. I will find you. I stared at the message until my eyes blurred with tears. Ernest. My Ernest had not been blind. He had known the danger creeping around him, even when I refused to see it. He had taken steps to protect me, even in his final days. The next morning, I dressed with unusual care. I chose my deep purple dress, the one I wore only for important occasions. My hands shook as I fastened the buttons, but I forced myself to stand tall. If I was about to face the man who could confirm the unthinkable, I needed to be strong. At 2:30, I walked toward the corner cafe, every step heavy with dread. The town felt different, as though every shadow concealed a pair of watching eyes. My son's accusations of paranoia suddenly seemed less like madness and more like survival. Inside the cafe, the air smelled of roasted coffee beans and freshly baked bread. People chatted softly at small tables, unaware that my entire life was unraveling. I went straight to the back, as instructed, and ordered chamomile tea to steady my nerves. My hands trembled against the worn wooden surface of the table. At exactly 3, a tall man with gray hair and sharp, intelligent eyes entered. He carried a brown folder under his arm. His gaze swept the room before settling on me. "Mrs. Hayes?" he asked quietly. I nodded, my throat too tight for words. "I'm Stephen Callahan," he said, pulling out the chair opposite mine. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Ernest was a good man." His words nearly undid me, but I swallowed the lump in my throat. "You knew my husband?" "Yes," Stephen said firmly. He placed the folder on the table. "Before I show you anything, I need you to understand the evidence I have will hurt. It will cut deep. Are you ready for that?" My hands gripped the edge of the table until my knuckles whitened. "I've been ready since the day I buried my husband. Show me." Stephen opened the folder and pulled out a small recorder. When he pressed play, Ernest's familiar voice filled the small space between us. "Stephen," his voice said, steady but tinged with worry, "if something happens to me, it won't be an accident. Charles and Henry have been pressuring me to increase my life insurance. Yesterday, Charles brought papers, said it was to protect Margot. But I saw clauses that benefit them directly. I don't trust this. I need you to watch them." The sound of Ernest's voice shattered me. For a moment, it felt like he was there with me again, protective, cautious, loving me even in his fear. Tears welled up, but I forced myself to listen. Stephen's eyes softened. That recording was made 3 weeks before his death, but there's more. He pressed play on another recording, and this time the voice that came through was Charles's, cold, detached, terrifying. "No, we can't wait any longer," Charles said. "The old man is getting suspicious. Yes, I already have the methanol. It works perfectly. Doctors will think it's a heart attack or stroke. Mom won't be a problem after Dad dies. She'll be too broken to resist." I gasped, my hand flying to my mouth. The cafe around me blurred, sounds fading until only that voice, my son's voice, remained. Stephen switched recordings again. This time it was Henry. "Everything's ready. Tomorrow, Charles will put the methanol in Dad's coffee. We told him it was a vitamin supplement. He'll drink it without question. By the time symptoms show, it'll be too late. The world tilted beneath me. The recorder clicked off, but the words lingered in the air like poison. My own sons, the children I had held in my arms, comforted through nightmares, raised with love and sacrifice, had murdered their father. And now, they planned to destroy me too. For a long moment after the last recording ended, I sat frozen in the cafe. The hum of voices around me faded. The clinking of cups and the hiss of the espresso machine seemed far away, unreal. All I could hear was the echo of Charles's voice, so calm, so casual as he spoke of methanol, of accidents, of me as though I were nothing more than an obstacle. I pressed my hand against my chest, trying to still the pounding of my heart. How? My voice cracked. How could my sons do this? Stephen looked at me with steady eyes, his voice low. Because they were desperate. Because greed and fear can twist even the closest bonds. I traced their finances. Charles owes $70,000 to loan sharks in the city. Henry has nearly $40,000 in gambling debts. They saw Ernest's insurance money as their salvation. The words cut like glass. Salvation bought with their father's life, and now mine. Stephen leaned forward, his voice firm. We have more than recordings. We have photos of Charles buying methanol in cash. We have bank records showing unexplained withdrawals. Ernest himself sensed the danger and left written notes. You are not crazy, Mrs. Hayes. You are the only one who can bring this truth to light. I closed my eyes, Ernest's voice from the recording still circling in my mind. If something happens to me, it won't be an accident. My husband had tried to warn me, and I had ignored the signs, clinging desperately to the illusion that my sons could never be capable of such cruelty. Tears streamed down my face, hot and relentless. I don't know if I have the strength for this, I whispered. Stephen's gaze softened, but his words carried weight. You do. Ernest believed in you. That's why he hired me to protect you, to give you the proof when the time came. And that time is now. If we don't act, they'll move forward with their plan to declare you incompetent. And once they succeed, it will be too late. The enormity of it crashed down on me. My boys, my flesh and blood, were no longer my protectors. They were predators circling, waiting for me to stumble. The grief that had weighed me down for weeks twisted into something new, something sharper. Rage. I wiped my tears, my hand trembling but steadying with each pass. They underestimated me, I said quietly, almost to myself. They think I'm weak, broken, but I will not let Ernest's death go unanswered. Stephen nodded, sliding the folder closer to me. Then we go to the police. Tonight. Sergeant O'Connell is one of the few men I trust. We'll give him everything: recordings, documents, photos. Once it's in the hands of the district attorney, Charles and Henry will have no way out. For the first time since Ernest's funeral, a spark of strength lit within me. My grief had not vanished, but it had transformed into something stronger, something more dangerous for my sons: determination. I looked at Stephen, my voice firm now. Let's end this. For Ernest, for the truth, for me. That night, as darkness fell over Spring Creek, Stephen and I walked side by side toward the police station. The street lamps glowed dimly, casting long shadows across the empty sidewalks. My heart pounded with each step, not only from fear but from a strange, fierce clarity. For weeks, I had been drowning in grief and doubt, but now I carried something else. Proof. Proof that could no longer be buried. Inside the station, Sergeant O'Connell was on duty, his tired eyes lifting with surprise when he saw us. Mrs. Hayes? Mr. Callahan? What brings you here so late? I drew a breath that seemed to come from the depths of my soul. I need to file a complaint, Sergeant. My husband Ernest was murdered by our sons. His pen froze midair. Silence pressed in on the room. Murder? He repeated, his voice cautious. Stephen placed the thick folder on the desk. We have evidence recordings of the sons planning the poisoning, financial records showing motive, photographs of Charles buying methanol, and Ernest's own written notes. We also have proof that the death certificate was falsified. Sergeant O'Connell leaned forward, flipping through the papers. listening to a sample of the recordings. As Charles's cold voice filled the room, the sergeant's expression hardened, his disbelief giving way to horror. He removed his cap and rubbed his forehead. "This is monstrous," he muttered. "Your own sons. They are no longer my sons," I said firmly, though my voice trembled. "They are criminals who murdered their father and tried to make me their next victim. I want justice." The sergeant nodded slowly. "Then justice you will have. But you must understand, once we open this case, there's no turning back. We'll need to exhume Ernest's body for toxicology. The process will be public, painful. Are you prepared for that?" My hands clenched tightly on the edge of the desk. "Do whatever it takes. Ernest deserves the truth." The district attorney was called in despite the late hour. When he arrived, his face pale but alert, he reviewed the evidence quickly yet thoroughly. His voice was steady when he spoke. "There's enough here to secure warrants. We'll move before dawn. If we wait, they may destroy documents or flee. We'll strike while they're unaware." Stephen turned to me, his voice gentle. "You'll be safe tonight. I'll walk you home and stay nearby. They won't touch you." But safety was a fragile illusion. I knew my sons were cunning, and desperation could drive them to anything. At home, I sat by the kitchen window, staring at the darkness outside, unable to rest. My phone rang at 6 a.m. Charles's voice on the line, urgent, almost panicked. "Mom, you need to come to Henry's house right away. Something terrible has happened." The lie dripped through every word, but I forced my voice to remain calm. "I'm on my way." I hung up, but I didn't move. Instead, I sat quietly, my pulse racing, knowing that at that very moment, police cars were already rolling toward their homes. By 7:30, I saw them from my window sirens flashing, officers moving with purpose. My phone buzzed again and again. Charles first, then Henry, their voices growing more frantic each time. But I didn't answer. I simply sat there in the silence of my kitchen, listening to the faint echo of sirens in the distance. At 9 a.m., a knock sounded on my door. Sergeant O'Connell stood there, his expression grave but resolute. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "we've arrested Charles and Henry. They are in custody, charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder." My legs trembled beneath me, but for the first time in weeks, the trembling wasn't from fear. It was from release, from the weight of truth finally breaking free. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Justice has begun, Ernest." The trial came 2 months later, but those weeks in between were some of the longest of my life. The town buzzed with rumors, the newspapers calling it the case of the killer sons. Neighbors stopped me on the street, some offering sympathy, others watching with pity, or even suspicion, as though they could not fathom a mother taking her own children to court. But I had already lost them long before the arrests. What stood in that courtroom were not my sons, but 2 men hollowed out by greed. The courthouse overflowed on the first day. Journalists filled the benches, cameras waited outside, and townspeople crowded in, desperate to witness what many called the darkest story Spring Creek had ever known. I wore black, not only for mourning, but as a shield, a reminder of what had been stolen from me. Stephen sat by my side, his steady presence anchoring me when the weight of it all threatened to crush me. Charles and Henry entered in orange prison uniforms, their hands bound in cuffs. Seeing them that way shattered something inside me, yet no tears came. The boys I once nursed and cradled were gone. What remained were men who had traded their humanity for debts and dollars. The prosecutor presented the evidence methodically, each piece striking like a hammer on stone. Recordings of Charles's voice planning the poisoning. Henry's words describing how Ernest would drink the vitamin supplement. Bank records tracing the desperate withdrawals. Photographs of Charles leaving the hardware store with a small bottle of methanol. And finally, the medical examiner confirming what I had already known in my heart. Ernest's body carried lethal levels of poison. When my turn to testify came, my legs trembled as I walked to the stand. I looked at the jury, then at the faces of my sons, and finally at the judge. My voice quivered, but did not break. "I loved them," I said. "I gave everything I had for them, and still, they murdered the man who raised them and plotted to take my life too. I cannot explain why. I can only show you what they did. Some in the courtroom wept. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Charles bowed his head in shame, but Henry's stare was defiant, his eyes burning with something I no longer recognized as love. After 3 days of testimony, the jury returned. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of my own heartbeat as the foreman read the verdict. Guilty, guilty on all counts. The judge's voice followed swiftly, heavy with finality. Charles Hayes and Henry Hayes, for the premeditated murder of your father and the conspiracy to murder your mother, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison, without possibility of parole for 30 years. A murmur swept through the courtroom. I closed my eyes, a weight lifting from me, though it left behind scars I would carry forever. Justice had been done. In the weeks that followed, I returned to my quiet house. Ernest's shop, once filled with the hum of machines, I transformed into a garden of roses, carnations, and sunflowers. Flowers for Ernest. Flowers for the love that no poison could erase. Letters came from prison. Charles wrote of regret, of unbearable guilt, while Henry's words were scattered, incoherent, twisted by madness. I read the first few, searching for traces of the boys I once knew, but eventually I stopped. The past could not be rewritten. My peace depended on leaving their words unopened. Jasmine vanished from town, her name whispered only in passing. Some said she moved to the city, others said she changed her name entirely. I did not care. Her shadow no longer reached me. What mattered was the foundation Ernest's death had inspired. With Stephen's help, I used the insurance money, not for comfort, not for escape, but to create the Ernest Hayes Foundation, helping families who, like me, had been betrayed from within. In its halls, I found a new family: survivors, fighters, people who turned pain into justice. 5 years have passed since the morning I buried an empty coffin. I am 71 now, my hair silver, my body slower, but my spirit stronger than ever. Every Sunday I walk to the cemetery with fresh flowers from my garden. On Ernest's gravestone, the words I chose remain carved deep. Beloved husband, betrayed father, honorable man. I tell him everything about the people we've helped, the letters of thanks, the lives saved because our truth came to light. And though the wind is the only reply, I feel him with me. I often wonder if people judge me harshly for condemning my own children. Some call me heartless, others call me brave. But I know this much: blood is not enough to define family. Love, loyalty, and respect, those are the true bonds. Ernest was my true family. Doris, Stephen, and the countless others who stood by me, they are my family now. On quiet nights, as I sit on the porch where Ernest and I once shared coffee, I whisper into the dark. I kept my promise. I found the truth. I sought justice. Your death was not in vain. And in the stillness, I swear I can feel him smile.